this book is the culmination of 3 years of work. Amy and I put together a weekly column. It's always a joy to work with all my colleagues at Democracy Now! Amy, in particular, is inspirational, educational.
Until now, I thought that Denis was a very credible partner.
She's, well, you see, you're seeing it already. I mean, if you listen regularly to Democracy Now!, you know, I mean, it's very, pretty serious stuff gets discussed there every day. And you don't perhaps see a lot of Amy's wit. These talks are opportunities for her to share some of that. She is a very, very witty person, and it comes out a lot in the columns. She traveled to the Middle East in the 80s with a group of people, one of whom wrote the foreword to the book. He was at the time not yet a filmmaker. He is now, Michael Moore. So this was a couple words from Michael before I hand off. Michael writes in the foreword, I first met Amy Goodman in the first month of the first Palestinian Intifada. It's where I usually go to meet people. You throw an intifada, I'm there. And so is Amy. In fact, if you're in the middle of any sort of rebellion, revolution, uprising, or you're just getting the familiar everyday ass-whooping by forces that seem much greater than yours, that is where you'll find the fearless Amy Goodman. It's safe to say that she lives by the promise Tom Joad made to his mother at the end of Steinbeck's Grapes of Wrath. I'll be everywhere. Wherever there's a fight so hungry people can eat, I'll be there. Wherever there's a cop beating up a guy, I'll be there. You know, Michael writes a wonderful introduction, yeah, if there's one thing you can trust, it's that Amy Goodman will always be there. The weeks we spent together in the West Bank and Gaza were, to say the least, quite harrowing, and yet they had a profound impact on both of us. It was just after Christmas 1987, and the Palestinian people had decided to rise up and resist their Israeli minders with protests, civil disobedience, and stones. Stones, remember the days of stones? Such an innocent time it was back then. Ralph Nader had asked a group of us, mostly writers and journalists, to go over to the occupied territories and bring back to the American public the truth about what was really going on. Little did we know we would be witnessing the first weeks of what sadly is now a 25-year-long resistance. Here's the dominant image in my head of Amy Goodman during that month in Palestine. When the Israeli soldiers started firing their rubber bullets at us and a group of unarmed Palestinians, we would run the other way, i.e. away from the bullets. And Amy Goodman would be running the opposite direction, straight into the melee. She appeared as if she were invincible, and while I do not want to imply she's some sort of superhero with supernatural powers, I will say I'm glad she's on our side and leave it at that. 2 years later, in 1990, Amy Goodman and fellow journalist Alan Nairn traveled to East Timor to cover their independence movement. And it was there that she personally witnessed the murder and massacre of 270 Timorese civilians by the Indonesian army. And for bearing witness to this horrific event, she and Alan were beaten by the army officials. I cannot imagine what it would be like to be present while 270 people are being killed. But there was Amy again on the front lines, searching out the truth and at great personal risk. Amy is a serious journalist who's won many of the nation's top journalism honors, including the George Polk Award, the Alfred I. DuPont Columbia University Award, and the Robert F. Kennedy Journalism Award, among others. Amy's daily television and radio show, Democracy Now!, is currently in its 16th year. How on earth she and her remarkable team pull this together day after day is beyond me. When I did a weekly TV show, I wanted to throw myself into the East River at the end of every week. I actually have to say I was recruited by Jeremy Scahill to work on one of the productions of that in the year 2000, and it was during the New Hampshire primaries, and it went like almost as completely awry as you can imagine, and it involved trying to get Steve Forbes to join a mosh pit, and it was pretty wild. So I can attest to the frustration Michael felt. I have been on her show many times, and I've seen backstage the incredible professional operation they have over there in downtown Manhattan. I do not know if they give tours like they do at NBC, but I would put the Democracy Now! Headquarters on any intelligent tourist must-see list, and we do give tours, so check it out. This book, produced in cooperation with the incomparable co-author, contains many of Amy's commentaries and columns over the past years. It is fascinating reading, a true chronicle of our times, and a real head shaker as you read it and wonder, how is it we're still here. Back in early 1988, as we traveled the back roads of the West Bank, going from one village to another, there was much that we saw that would make even the most committed among us give up hope, beset with the knowledge that true justice seemed like a faraway destination. After all, this was a struggle between a massive military machine that had nuclear weapons and children with slingshots. Who wins that fight? Well, there was a day a long, long time ago that an oppressed people had a young boy with a slingshot, and that boy used that slingshot, and for that, his people would be free. So we didn't leave Palestine in total despair. In fact, we were deeply inspired by the will and determination of the people we met, people who had nothing, people who were in it for the long haul and had no intention of giving up. And I know there are people like that in this room. It was a good lesson for us to learn, Michael wrote. It would be another 2 years before I would release my first film, Roger and Me, and it would be another 8 years before Democracy Now! Would go on the air. We became committed to doing our best with the slingshots we have. And that's the foreword by Michael Moore, and it's part of this silenced majority. There's been a lot of exciting events and experiences already on the tour, and with your help, I'll welcome Amy to talk about some of them. Thank you.
Thank you. Denis is the man who doesn't know the definition of only one word. Everything else, he is truly remarkable. A remarkable writer and researcher, friend, colleague, but he has never managed to understand the word impossible. He makes everything possible. And I thank Denis for all of his work over the years, from the beginning of Democracy Now!, expanding it from when we were on a few dozen community radio stations, wonderful ones at that, beginning in 1996 as the only daily election show in public broadcasting, right through to today. Now broadcasting on over 1,100 public radio and television stations around the country and around the world. I can't bear that everyone's out there. Is there any way you could fill in the aisles and sit more comfortably inside? No? Against the rules? Oh, sorry. Far be it from me to break a rule. Now, usually, this is an amazing place to come. I mean, we have so many friends here. My family is usually sitting here as well. My brother Steve Goodman, who was long a professor at Johns Hopkins at the School of Medicine and the School of Public Health. Unfortunately, they have left and moved on to Stanford, West Coast. I haven't forgiven them either. But I'm going to pretend they're just sitting right there. But yes, I see family anyway in the front. So I absolutely think of you that way. And especially this summer, I've spent a lot of times at Johns Hopkins Hospital with a friend, and if there's anyone there from the hospital, I deeply appreciate what you do. Well, it's wonderful to be here. As Denis said, we're on around City 30. Tomorrow at noon, we head to Richmond, and then tomorrow night we'll be in Norfolk, and then on Monday night, we have to do the broadcast somewhere. I'm not sure where on Monday morning. You see, we have to do a TV radio broadcast no matter where we are in the world every single day from 8 to 9 Eastern Standard Time. And that is astonishing in itself what happens on this journey. On Monday night, it's Blacksburg. We'll be interviewing for Tuesday's show Nikki Giovanni, as well as Colin Goddard. And Colin Goddard is a remarkable young man who was going to college at Virginia Tech when he was shot, along with so many other students and faculty, 32 dead in all, in the Virginia Tech massacre. I believe he's the only student to return to Virginia Tech to graduate. And we're going to be going to Virginia Tech with him. To say the least, his life changed after being shot 4 times and barely surviving. But he is now with the Brady Center Against Gun Violence, and they are waging a campaign to try to get the PBS News anchor Jim Lehrer, who will host the presidential debate on Wednesday night in Denver, where we will also be. The Brady Center, remember who the Brady Center is named for? Jim Brady, who was the press secretary for Ronald Reagan. When the attempted assassination on the president happened, Jim Brady was shot through the head, but he survived, and together with his wife, Sarah, they founded the Brady Center Against Gun Violence. So they're trying to get Jim Lehrer to ask a question of the presidential candidates about gun violence. You know, so often in the corporate media, you hear that the problem in Washington is the partisan bickering, is the stalemate, the gridlock. But I think the problem is the bipartisan consensus on so many issues. Whether we're talking about their stand on guns or whether we're talking about the longest war in U.S. history in Afghanistan. You know, one of the odd things about the mystery guest standing up in Tampa at the convention center, that would be Clint Eastwood, you know, against the backdrop of a huge shadow of Dirty Harry with that automatic rifle. One of the strange moments was, aside from, you know, dragging out a chair, an empty chair, and talking to that chair as if it was President Obama, that he was invisible. You know, the underlying racism of that, The Invisible Man by Ralph Ellison. But aside from that, he then went on to say that, you know, critics say here is President Obama who promised to close Guantanamo. And yet, here we are years later. Now, I think a lot of people agree with that. The only thing is I didn't expect to hear it from the stage of the Republican convention. And then he talked about President Obama presiding over the longest war in U.S. history in Afghanistan, and something about Mitt Romney would pull the troops out the next day. I think there was no one more surprised than Mitt Romney to hear what his great supporter Clint Eastwood was saying. But to be here with all of you on this trip, we'll be in Virginia Tech on Monday night, broadcasting on Tuesday. We'll be interviewing Colin Goddard, and then we will fly to Denver, do a big event in Boulder. Then Wednesday night, we will be broadcasting the presidential debate as well, like so many of the networks. But we will expand the debate. We will break the sound barrier, because we will include some of the third-party candidates, not in a discussion afterwards, you know, just asking them what they think of the debate that they were excluded from, but actually have them in real time participate in the debate. They may not be inside, but through the magic of technology, we can include them in that debate, every question that is asked, and it'll be interesting. I mean, that's what we're supposed to do in the media. I see the media as a huge kitchen table that stretches across the globe, that we all sit around and debate and discuss the most important issues of the day. War and peace, life and death. And anything less than that is a disservice to the servicemen and women of this country. Remember, they can't have these debates on military bases. They rely on us in civilian society to have the discussions that lead to the decisions about whether they live or die, whether they are sent to kill or be killed. Anything less than that is a disservice to a democratic society. So we'll bring in some people that may not agree on extending the war or keeping Guantanamo open or the whole issue of gun control or the whole issue of torture or, you know, it might surprise some to know that President Obama, the administration, is now involved in more prosecutions of whistleblowers than all presidents combined. Whistleblowers, by that I mean, well, we just drove from Washington, D.C. here, so we passed the NSA. right? The National Security Agency, which is a number of times larger than the Central Intelligence Agency. And those of you who work in either of them here, you know what you do. And some of the people within the NSA at the highest levels started to feel after 9/11 that what you do is problematic, that they are increasingly seeing a level of surveillance of Americans that they just could not stomach. And so they started to speak out. And that has led to their own prosecution and persecution. These are very serious issues, which is why we need to expand the debate. And we need a media that goes outside the consensus in Washington. Because I really do feel that those who are deeply concerned about war on every level, whether the killings of innocent civilians, whether the deaths of Americans sent there, whether the environmental impacts or the just financial costs of war, trillions of dollars when people are being foreclosed on at home, when millions don't have health care. Can we afford this in any sense? I really do think that those who care about these issues, who care about health care, that in this country, the wealthiest country on earth, how is it that we can't take care of the citizens and non-citizens of this country in a basic way? People who care about climate change, who are experiencing the fires, the droughts. I mean, in some parts of this country, back to the Dust Bowl 75 years ago. Those who care about these issues and the increasing inequality at a level we've never seen in this country, those who care are not a fringe minority, not even a silent majority, but the silenced majority, silenced by the corporate media, which is why we have to take it back. You know, Democracy Now! Covered both conventions, the Republican convention in Tampa, the Democratic convention in Charlotte. And I mean, there's so many things to talk about. When we were headed down to Tampa, you know, we heard there might be a hurricane that could cancel the convention, which really surprised me. I was in the newsroom saying, oh my gosh, could there really be this hurricane that could cancel the Republican convention? And my colleague Steve Martinez, video producer at Democracy Now!, said, is it a legitimate hurricane? Now, you know what he was referring to, Todd Akin's comments, the man who was ahead in the race for the Senate seat in Missouri that Claire McCaskill now has, and he's running against her. But he said to a local reporter that women who are legitimately raped you know, won't get pregnant because their bodies shut down. For you doctors in the audience, I didn't refer to him as Dr. Akin, but, you know, Congressman Akin. And when Julie Crosby, our general manager, heard Steve ask if it was a legitimate hurricane, she said, because if it is legitimate, not to worry, Tampa will shut down, won't allow any water in. So we headed down to Tampa, and, you know, this is the first post-Citizens United election. We're going to see a level of money in this election that we have never seen in history. Something like, well, $2 billion is going to be spent. And we won't know where a lot of that money is from. But there are movements around this country that are challenging that. In North Carolina alone, at least 10 cities and towns have passed resolutions called Move to Amend to support a constitutional amendment against Citizens United. And we see this everywhere. So our first job at the Republican convention was to follow the money. I mean, our senior producer, Mike Burke, went with Hani Massoud through the corporate suites, or through the halls where the corporate suites were. And they hit 571, which was Sheldon Adelson's suite. You know, you open the door and they're sort of unassuming business hallways, but you open the door and then these rooms open into skyboxes that overlook the convention floor. And so as they're coming up to 571, they actually see Sheldon Adelson. You know who he is. He's the casino billionaire magnate who has casinos in places like Vegas and Macau, has been investigated for bribery and corruption, started by supporting Newt Gingrich, giving him millions of dollars. Then, I think somewhat begrudgingly, because the nominee became Mitt Romney, has thrown his support there and says he's going to spend something like $100 million. So it was up to Mike to go up to him to ask exactly how much he planned to spend. And he did get to ask that question, but before he knew it, the woman who was standing between Mike and Mr. Adelson stepped back and body slammed Mike and threw him off balance. This had never happened to Mike before, so he's very taken aback. And Hani is a tall, strong basketball player. He played on like the equivalent of the Egyptian national basketball team, and he's holding this camera. He's not realizing what's happened, and suddenly the same woman grabs his camera, runs into the Adelson suite, and Hani is looking at her and puts his foot in the door because he wants his property back, and she slams the camera on the ground. Now, Mike immediately is reaching for his Android phone to start to try to document, because now their camera is gone and the security and the Adelson team are trying to rip his camera out of his hand. This is very surprisingly, because I would have thought Mr. Adelson respected private property. But they don't really know what's going on until a main spokesperson for Mr. Adelson steps out of the Adelson suite and gives Mike a card and says, "We'll make you whole. We'll deal with all of this tomorrow. We'll take care of everything." And Mike's saying, "What is going on here? Who was that woman?" He said, "That would be Mr. Adelson's daughter." So Hani gets his camera back, and they're watching Karl Rove go into the suite. They're watching Newt Gingrich go into the suite. You know, this is democracy in action here. And then it becomes a little embarrassing for the Adelsons, because everyone's now picked up the story. You know, the Adelson family assaults the Democracy Now! Team. And so the New York Times picks it up, and Politico, even Glenn Beck's website described it accurately. So the Adelson family puts out a press release the next day. You know, they are nothing if not well lawyered up. They know exactly how to deal. They knew they couldn't make charges against us because we have the videotape, and there's so many people around. So they said that they believe that journalists should be peaceful. We actually agree. You know, they were trying to make it seem, but they knew they couldn't actually make an allegation. So just a straightforward statement. Journalists should be nonviolent, and they wished us well covering the rest of the Republican convention. So then I went on the convention floor to the New York delegation because David Koch was serving as a New York delegate. David and Charles Koch are the billionaire oil and gas magnates who have been funding the Tea Party, and looks like they'll be pouring something like $400 million into this election. You know, David and Charles Koch's father, Fred Koch, is the co-founder of the John Birch Society. And for those of you who know anything about history, the John Birch Society was that racist, it still exists, founded in Appleton, Wisconsin, organization fighting any kind of integration, you know, certainly as an obstacle and an impediment to any kind of progress in this country, people like Martin Luther King, and went after him and the whole civil rights movement. There's an interesting story, actually. You know, Mitt Romney's father was Michigan Governor George Romney. And when he was not 2 years in office, Barry Goldwater was running for president. A lot of people encouraged Governor Romney to run against him. And Governor Romney brought his high school son, Mitt, to the convention that year, 1964. And he didn't run, but he did address the platform committee. And he expressed grave concern about extremism in the Republican Party. And he said he was afraid it would destroy the Republican Party. you know, Barry Goldwater's vehement opposition to voting rights, to civil rights. And he particularly singled out, Governor Romney singled out the John Birch Society. He wouldn't endorse Barry Goldwater. And Goldwater was very angry. And Governor Romney wrote him a many-page letter explaining just why. He was against the hate. And it's interesting now that the sons of the co-founder of the John Birch Society are the ones, helping to fund the son of Governor George Romney. Just an interesting fact. So I went over on the next day of the convention to interview David Koch, certainly an important player in Republican politics and in what's happening in this country today. And as I went over to ask him a question, I reached my mic over. He was sitting among the New York delegates, and with my cameraman over my shoulder, John Hamilton. And I said to Mr. Koch, are you concerned that unchecked, concentrated wealth will subvert democracy? At that point, all the delegates around him stood up like a stand of trees sprouting up in seconds, and he remained sitting. I mean, he is a towering figure, but he was cowering behind all of them as they protected him from this question. We tried to get a photograph from our video for our website, and I hope all of you check out democracynow.org, and the only one we could get was him looking up. You could just barely see his eye. And so I asked the person next to him. Think of this as the convention. This was the New York delegation. There was Utah. You guys here are the Wisconsin delegation. New Hampshire was over here. And I asked the man who sprouted up next to him, Mr. Cox, that's Ed Cox. They had name tags on. He's the longtime chair of the Republican Party of New York. Ed Cox is the son-in-law of the late President Richard Nixon and the husband of Tricia Nixon, Tricia Cox. And I asked him, are you concerned that unchecked, concentrated wealth will subvert democracy? And he said no. And so it's interesting, though. Do you know that he was an original Nader's Raider? Ed Cox was. So we went on to question other people. Actually, I went on to question, did you see Abe Lincoln? Thank you. Did you see Abe Lincoln at the Republican convention? Unbelievable. This guy looked more Abe than Abe. He was wearing a top hat. It was incredible. All the media was interviewing him, and he was definitely playing it up. He had the tails, he had the top hat. It was incredible. So I went over to him. I said, Abe, what's happened to your party? And it turned out he really was a Missouri delegate. And when I learned he was a Missouri delegate, that means he's somehow a colleague of Todd Akin. And I asked him if he knew Akin. He said, oh, sure, I served with him in the state legislature. And I asked what he thought of Todd Akin's comments. And he said that he thought he had misspoken and people should forgive him. Now, I actually do think when people misspeak, it's really a waste of time the way the media makes all of the stuff of gaffes. There's so much important to talk about. But in this case, I didn't think he misspoke. I mean, he was expressing a whole school of thought. And the Republican Party wants him out because they're afraid of losing the Senate seat in Missouri and then not being able to regain the Senate. But I think it's more than that. Karl Rove deserted him, his super PAC. And thank goodness for Sheila Kohatkar of Bloomberg Business Week, because she's a reporter who got into a super PAC meeting that Karl Rove held in Tampa. And she documented what he said to this group of very high-flying donors. He said, if Todd Akin is found murdered, don't go looking for me. When this came out in Bloomberg Business Week, Karl Rove had to apologize. But I think that they're not as concerned about Akin as about the kind of light this sheds on the vice presidential nominee, Paul Ryan. They have co-sponsored a lot of legislation together. And I don't just mean, supported, but co-sponsored. where they refer to, for example, forcible rape. Forcible rape, as if there's another kind of rape. And when now Congressman Ryan is asked about this, he says rape is rape, which is the right thing to say, because it just shows when you shed the spotlight on these issues and you really hone in on them, that there's nothing else he could really say. So when they said, then why do you use that word forcible, what they've been doing for years? He said, oh, that's just boilerplate language. So I asked Abe about this, George Engelbach, and I said, what about this issue of forcible rape? And he said, well, yeah, he's talking about brutal rape. And I said, is there a non-brutal rape? And he said, well, certainly, you know, like when it's a girl or a lady who's inebriated or who's high on drugs, or you slip her a Mickey. I mean, I was speaking to a Missouri delegate who represents a large population back in his home state. Abe, I said. And then we went on. These are the kinds of conversations we were having. So then came the last night, and we were over in New Hampshire questioning the delegates there. And then, you know, Clint Eastwood appeared, and after that, Mitt Romney. He made his appearance from the back, and he was walking down the stage. There are thousands of people. You can't really see what's going on if you're on one part of the floor, but we could see on the Jumbotron, Mitt Romney had made his entrance, and I recognized, there are a lot of aisles, the aisle he was on, because I had walked this aisle so many times. It was the New York, Utah, Wisconsin delegation. I recognized Senator Hatch's sneakers. I recognized, you know, he's coming up on the New York delegation. So I said to John, our videographer, start filming the Jumbotron. And he said, well, I don't have to film the Jumbotron. That's the video we get back in New York. We're reporters. We get the pool feed. It'll come out later. The whole world is watching Mitt Romney come down the aisle. Let's focus on the New Hampshire delegation. Let's get what the others can't get. I said, film the Jumbotron. You never know what the rest of the world will see. But I expect he's coming up to the New York delegation. It will be interesting how he and David Koch interact. So he comes up on the New York delegation, and there is this pole that says New York, and we're filming it on the Jumbotron. And as he comes up to David Koch, he stops, he shakes his hand, he puts his arm on him, and he points at him, and then he moves on. Not a big deal. He's shaking hands with a lot of supporters. Of course he'd stop and hug and point at one of his biggest supporters and moved on. But we'd have that picture, and it is emblematic of what's happening today. And we'd run it the next day. So late at night, at the end of the convention, I call Robbie Karen, our video producer in New York, who works each night so remarkably. I said, Robbie, pull the video of Governor Romney shaking hands with David Koch. And he said, what video of Governor Romney shaking hands? I said, come on. I said, actually, that makes sense. You probably don't recognize David Koch because he's very much a behind-the-scenes guy, but he's sort of this tall, elegant-looking man, and he's like almost as tall as the New York pole that is there showing the delegation. And he says, well, no. He says, he comes down to the New York delegation, and just as he seems to be reaching, it cuts away. And it shows two young women with red, white, and blue feather boas sort of wrapped around their necks, and they're very enthusiastic. And then it cuts to a full convention floor shot, and then it goes back to him shaking hands with the New York delegation and coming onto the stage. But you missed that. So I said, okay, you send that video to us. We've got the video from the Jumbotron. We'll do a split screen the next day. And there it was on Democracy Now! What we saw, what actually happened on the floor of the convention, and what the rest of the world saw. I called Reuters that morning, and I said, because we get the pool feed, where did you get this feed? And they said, well, you know, each day another network is responsible, so you don't have a lot of chaos with all the networks getting the same thing. And they said that day they thought it was NBC. But I don't even necessarily think it was NBC calling the shots. They could have been hooked into a box with maybe the RNC feeding the images. I actually don't know, and I do think it could have been coincidental, that missing 7 seconds. But the fact of the matter is, only if you tuned into Democracy Now! Did you see the Koch-Romney handshake. Now, Except, of course, if you watch the rest of the networks, because they all showed our split screen of the Koch-Romney handshake, which is why I call it trickle-up journalism. But, you know, I mentioned Hani Massoud, our great video producer, who last year was with the great Sharif Abdel-Quddus, our senior producer, back in Cairo covering Tahrir. How many of you experienced the Egyptian revolution through the remarkable reports of our reporter, Sharif Abdel-Quddus? Absolutely amazing what he did. Ah, yes, Sharif. So he worked with us for 8 years, and then the revolution started to unfold. He's an Egyptian American like Hani, and he comes from a very illustrious family. His grandfather is the most famous writer of Egypt, Hassan Abdel-Quddus. And he starts to get these texts in January of 2011 from his cousins, from his friends, saying, like, I'll die for the revolution. He's saying, no, these cousins, they would not do this. They are not political. What are they talking about? And he realizes there is a major shift happening in Egypt. And Sharif flies straight into Tahrir and doesn't leave. Hani follows him with the video camera. Now, you remember what Mubarak did at the beginning of the revolution. He plunged the country into digital darkness. He turned off the internet. Well, he couldn't do it alone. He used Naras, a California company, to actually flip the switch. And when there was such global outcry, Naras, an American company, put out a press release saying they were only following orders. You know, we've heard that before. But Sharif joked that was Mubarak's fatal error, turning off the internet. He said, we're Egyptian after all. We would have been inside on Facebook, on the internet, and now he turned it off, so we all had to go outside. So there they were in Tahrir. And then they turned the internet back on, but the thugs brought down the satellites. They actually physically broke them apart, going into TV studio offices. And we're using satellite as well. But from the beginning of Democracy Now! 16 years ago, we've always been scrappy, didn't start having the financing we others had for satellites, so we used the internet. We would send our radio through the internet, MP3s, and then when we started on television in the week of September 11th, 2001, we pioneered a way to send broadcast quality video through the internet. So when the satellites go down, we can do it just fine through the internet. So I remember seeing Anderson Cooper in his hotel room, sort of looking a little like old Democracy Now! On Skype, and it said in the lower third, reporting from an undisclosed location in Cairo. And there was Sharif in Tahrir saying, I'm in Tahrir, exactly where he was, saying it's the safest place to be in Egypt right now. And when the networks weren't able to send their images on satellite, there was Hani leaping buildings in a single bound, jumping over burning barriers, taking Sharif's remarkable interviews, racing to his house, and through the night developing these 20, 25-minute reports, strolls through Tahrir, where you got a chance, and then sending them through the internet, where you got a chance to meet Ahdaf Souef, the great Egyptian writer who wrote Map of Love, or Dr. Nawal Saadawi, who was the 79-year-old psychiatrist who wrote so many books, ran for president, was imprisoned under Sadat, was exiled under Mubarak, was holding salons before Tahrir, telling young people when they were in despair, no, we will win, we will win. And also seeing the high school girl who was putting out a broadsheet called Voices of Tahrir, in the shadow of the state media building that had spewed lies for so many decades. And you met them all, people speaking for themselves. Sharif was then being interviewed on all the networks. Every day, every hour, you would see him on MSNBC, on CNN, of course, on Democracy Now! Again, another example of trickle-up journalism, why we must support independent media. The power of people speaking for themselves. Because when you hear a Palestinian child or an Israeli grandmother, when you hear an Afghan aunt or an Iraqi uncle or a woman who's lost her family in a drone attack in Pakistan or Yemen, it breaks down barriers. You understand who they are. It doesn't mean you have to agree with them, just like we don't agree with our family members so often, but you start to understand where they're coming from. It breaks down the barriers that fuel the hate groups, the caricatures that allow hate and war to fester, that make war more possible. You know, I want to go back to World War II. The Secretary of State, the Secretary of War, Henry Stimson, who when handed the Japanese city bombing list of the possible cities to drop the first atomic bombs on, Hiroshima, Nagasaki, Kyoto was on the list, Secretary Stimson crossed off Kyoto. Why? He said he and Mrs. Stimson had visited Kyoto. It was a beautiful city. The people were lovely. Think about how profound this was. If only the people of Hiroshima and Nagasaki got a chance to host the Stimsons as well, because he knew this city, and that is the power of media. I mean, outside of us learning from our friends and our family about different places, outside of that, we learn about the rest of the world through the media. And it has to be through something other than a corporate lens. Just as it has to be through something other than a corporate lens when the rest of the world learns about us. It is too dangerous when it is brought to you by networks with these pundits who know so little about so much, explaining the world to us and getting it so wrong. But I want to get to the Democratic Convention, because we flew from Tampa to Charlotte, to this city rich with civil rights history. You know, the Greensboro sit-ins, the students who sat in to integrate the lunch counters in Greensboro, North Carolina, inspired the students from the local college to sit in the lunch counters in Charlotte. And that launched, in so many ways, was a part of the civil rights movement. That was 1960. And so on the first day of the Democratic Convention in Charlotte, it was interesting to see the reincarnation of the civil rights movement in 2012. And those are the undocumented immigrants, especially the young people who have sat in on offices like President Obama's campaign offices and other Congress members and other senators, demanding passage of the DREAM Act and demanding a fair and rational immigration policy in this country. It starts with the young people. It's been absolutely amazing. And they risk more than arrest when they engage in civil disobedience. They risk deportation, often to countries they have almost no memory of. I was just speaking last night in Charlottesville at the University of Virginia, and after all the book signing, and I really look forward to signing your books, and I hope you get several books, and then you get a free DVD that's Michael Moore talking about his life. It's a wonderful DVD. And think about the holidays and gifts you want to get, and giving an extra book or a DVD to the Enoch Pratt Library and other places. But yes, we want to drive this book up the New York Times bestseller list, because think about what usually gets there. We want people to have access in these small stores that only take the top 10 books and nothing else, to a whole universe of other voices and ideas, and to send a message to publishers around this country that people are hungry for independent voices. But at the end of the book signing, and you can come up even if you don't get a book, I'm just so happy to meet you, and if you have an issue you want raised. But last night, at the end of the book signing, I saw a woman hanging back, and she came over. She was a student, and she was from Venezuela, and she started to cry, and she said, "I'm one of them, I'm one of them." And I said, "You're one of what?" And she said, "I'm one of them." And I said, "One of who?" And she said, "I'm one of the undocumented immigrants. It's not something I talk about very much." And But when she heard the story of the young people around the country who've been sitting in, who've been demanding change, and who definitely embarrassed President Obama to the point where he announced that there would be a reprieve, deferred action, that young people, young undocumented immigrants, 30 years old or younger, who meet certain criterion can get a reprieve from deportation for at least 2 years to work and go to school in this country. Okay, President Obama said they can't get health care, but they can go to school and they can go to work here. And hundreds of thousands of them are now signing up because these young people sat in offices, and it was too embarrassing in an election year. And especially President Obama, who is a community organizer himself, who knows well the dictum of Frederick Douglass, power concedes nothing without a demand. It never will, and it never has. And so on the first day of the convention, it was pouring rain. It was about 4 o'clock, right around the time the Democratic convention was gavelled in. And I got a text, there's going to be an action on a particular corner, and I run over with a camera person, and there's other foreign reporters there and with their cameras. And I see the police are getting a little nervous across the street. We're not quite sure what's about to happen. And I'll talk about the militarization of police in a minute because it's unacceptable in this country. But all of a sudden, a bus pulled up. It was the Undocu bus. It was covered in butterflies. And out streamed young and old, young people and older people with tremendous energy. And they started to walk very fast. They're right near the gates of the convention center, chanting, "No papers, no fear. No papers, no fear." And as they came out of the bus, I started to interview Rosie Carrasco. We just had her on Democracy Now! That morning. I said, "Rosie, can you tell us what you're doing?" And as I'm talking to her, a well-known television pundit comes up to me, and he says, "What are they doing? What's happening here? Why are the police moving in?" I said, "I think they're about to get arrested." He said, "What does she want? What are you talking to her about?" I said, "Why don't you ask her?" And, I mean, she is standing 3 feet, maybe 2 feet from me. And he said, "No, just tell me. Just tell me quickly." I said, "Rosie, can you tell this gentleman why it is you're standing in the pouring rain with the police pouring in, what you're about to do, why you are here at the Democratic convention?" And she looks at him and she says, "I want to know what kind of legacy President Obama wants." She said, "I want to know whether President Obama wants to preside over more deportations of immigrants in U.S. history, if that's how he wants to be remembered, or if he wants to be remembered as the president on the side of the immigrants." Pretty eloquent. And the reporter, the television pundit, is quickly taking out his notebook and writing this down. Why is it so difficult to ask a person at the grassroots what it is that they want? And I hope that he did go off to his network. Since I was in the street, I couldn't know for sure. And actually, in the next half hour, when he was talking to millions, talk about what this immigrant had to say. Maybe next time he'd invite her on television and she could speak for herself. Oh my God. Okay, I'm going to try to break a record here by speaking faster than I've ever spoken. I think I lost track of time. And so they marched, and they marched to the front gates of the Democratic Convention. They unfurled a banner with a huge butterfly, and the women and the men and the children sat down on this banner. Rosie's husband was named Martin Nzueta, and he said, "I have paid taxes in this country for 18 years, which is more than Citibank can say." Rosie and Martin and their daughter were getting arrested. And then I said to a young woman who's had her arm wrapped around her mother the entire time, "You look like you could qualify under this new executive order, to get a reprieve of deportation." And she said, "I can, but my mother can't. And if she's deported, I might as well be." And then I asked, as these families were getting arrested one by one lone woman who was sitting right next to the butterfly, about to be hauled off by the police, I asked her, "Why the butterflies?" And she said, "Because butterflies know no borders. Butterflies are free." And with that, she was handcuffed and put into the police wagon, and they were arrested. just some of the scenes of the streets. I'm not even quite sure where to go because I have 2 minutes. I wanted to tell the story of Frederick Douglass and Rosa Parks and talk about what happened in the 2008 Republican convention, the concern about the militarization of police. Could I have an extra reprieve of 7 minutes? I think I could fit it all in. Okay. So, really quickly, this issue of the militarization of police is a very serious issue in this country, and we should not get used to it. It is a true threat to a democratic society, to people being able to express dissent, because dissent is what will save us. Since 9/11, billions of dollars have been poured into local police departments. They are getting drones. They are getting tanks. The level of surveillance has increased astronomically. AP has done a series of excellent reports for which they won the Pulitzer Prize this year, culminating in the reports say, looking at one police department, New York, and how they have surveilled the Muslim and Arab American community in New York, thousands of people. The police call it mosque crawling. They go into the mosques. They go into Arab American businesses. They're monitoring Muslim students. Why? Have they broken the law? Have they acted suspicious? And they've not only stayed in New York City, they've gone to New Jersey, they've gone to Connecticut. These are what we have the documents for now that AP got under the Freedom of Information Act. I mean, the president of Yale University issued a statement saying, this is unacceptable, going after our students in this way. New Jersey officials said the same. The New York police are coming into New Jersey. It was a New Jersey landlord who found in one of his apartments a huge amount of surveillance equipment. He was shocked, so he called the police. It was only then he found out it was the police. And then on Democracy Now!, we had on a young CUNY student, City University of New York, a college student who came on the broadcast because he was named in these documents that AP had got under the Freedom of Information Act. His family didn't want him to come on the show. They didn't want him targeted, but he said, Mom, Dad, I am targeted. I'm already named. My only protection is if I speak out. So he came on the show, and he said, I don't want to sound hysterical, but I have a little amount of time. And he said that they had documented a camping trip he took with his friends one weekend from school. And they figured out that the infiltrator was probably the guy that took them on the camping trip. And they had everything that they did on this trip. And he said they even wrote in the documents that these students were so extreme that they prayed 4 times a day. He said this infiltrator was so stupid that he didn't even know we pray 5 times a day. And the final piece in the series that AP did said that they haven't come up with one lead from thousands and thousands of these incidents of surveillance. When you antagonize and monitor and crack down on a community in this way, do you think this increases national security? By no means. It actually makes all of us, and especially those communities, less secure because they become afraid and they close in on themselves. And they're afraid to talk about if there are any problems in their community. I was recently asked, but what do you do when you see these various attacks, and especially 9/11? Why wouldn't you go after these communities? And I said, well, maybe that sounds logical, but if it is, when Timothy McVeigh attacked the Oklahoma City building, why weren't white Christian communities all over this country put under surveillance? You don't generalize from an individual act. And when you see, I mean, I think we all agree with the Posse Comitatus Act, right? The idea that it's not a really good idea to have soldiers marching through the streets of the United States. But the way the authorities have gotten around this is by militarizing the police. And that is very frightening. We've seen it with the Occupy movement. I mean, unprecedented numbers of people being arrested in the first weeks, and we just passed the first anniversary of Occupy. And I mean, there's so much to say about this, but the way the corporate media dealt with the Occupy movement, they first did not report on it at all. September 17th last year, just one day after another, you got nothing if that's all you watched or that's all you listened to. And then they started to mock them. What do these people want? All these different views. They have every different issue under the sun. Really, I think any Madison Avenue PR executive would have drooled to have been credited with the motto, "We are the 99%. What could be more powerful? What has been a more resonant message in history than even the word Occupy that is known now throughout the world? And then when they, after the silence, they started to ridicule. But, you know, Mahatma Gandhi said it very well. First they ignore you, then they laugh at you, then they fight you, then you win. But then the police cracked down on these encampments all over the country. And you don't have to take it from me, this issue of the militarization of police. Take it from Seattle Police Chief Norm Stamper, the one who cracked down, tried to stamp out dissent at the Battle of Seattle in 1999, hit these thousands of protesters, high school kids with their teachers, union activists, doctors, nurses, French farmers, all gathering to protest the World Trade Organization. Norm Stamper tried to stamp them out. He was eventually forced out because of this, you know, denying that they're hitting the students with rubber bullets, but then we're picking up the rubber bullets by the handful. That's when indie media hit its heyday. You know, indiemedia.org was getting more hits than CNN.com because CNN was simply reporting what the police were saying. Meanwhile, at indie media, we were picking up the rubber bullets. Not too hard to photograph them and show that this was what was happening. Norm Stamper now says it was the biggest mistake of his life. And he says, use me as a model of what not to do. He says, I set up our police department to take on these young people and older people as if they were the enemy, when they could have been their nieces, their mothers, their grandmothers. And I'm having my police move in and physically attack them and gas them. And yet when we had on a spokesperson for the Police Foundation, who coordinated a conference call between 18 police chiefs on how to deal with the Occupy encampments, and had on Norm Stamper as well, the police spokesman said to Chief Stamper, I just want to say how honored I am to be on this broadcast with you because we see you as the model. And Norm said, no, I'm the model of what not to do. Dissent is what will save us. And I see the media should be that sanctuary of dissent. Being in Maryland, I have to tell the story of Frederick Douglass, so I'm just going to tell it, even though many of you have heard this before and you know the story yourself, but it's just so significant, and it tells us about movements and all that is important. Frederick Douglass, the greatest abolitionist. It was soon after Barack Obama was elected, and that was an historic moment, whatever your political persuasion. If nothing else, the first African-American elected in a land with a legacy of slavery. And all the movements that elected President Obama, who came together, the anti-war movement, the environmental movement, civil rights, environmental justice, racial justice, economic justice movements, the gay and lesbian movements, all of these movements together. And when Barack Obama was elected, I think the world heaved a sigh of relief. People had felt they had hit their heads against a brick wall for so long, that wall became a door. It opened a crack. The question was, would it be kicked open or slammed shut? And that is not up to that one person in the White House, though he is the most powerful person on earth. It is up to all of you and people all over this country if you believe in democracy, because democracy isn't just achieved. It's something we fight for every single day. When all these movements elected Barack Obama, I think partly they were exhausted and shocked themselves, but also didn't want to contribute to a right-wing backlash. You know, the birther movement, this idea that he is the other, that he couldn't be possibly born in this country. And people, I think, lost their footing. When the community organizer-in-chief becomes the commander-in-chief, who becomes the community organizers, and what do they demand? When President Obama is in the White House, in the Oval Office, and those that are used to having the ear of the most powerful person on earth whisper in it their demands, if he can't point out the window and say, if I do that, they will storm the Bastille, if there's no one out there, he's in big trouble. And that's when he agrees with you. What about when you disagree with him? What do you do? And that is the challenge today. That idea of, does that door get kicked open? Whatever you want, how do you make your views heard? It really does matter. It is a scandal that in this country, So many people don't vote. When I was asked to be host of Democracy Now!, I was in Haiti. People were gunned down when they went to the polls, and the vast majority of people still went to the polls. Here, that doesn't happen, and yet people still don't go out. Not that they're apathetic. Maybe it has to do with not feeling that there is a real choice, but also people are involved in their communities. I don't think they're apathetic. So after Barack Obama...
They're yelling at me.
Okay. So how will I go with this?
Go ahead.
After Barack Obama was elected, but before he was inaugurated, he and Michelle Obama were going to the White House to be toured around by the Bushes, and I was invited on CNN and asked, what I thought of them going into the White House. There were a bunch of pundits on in other studios, and they were jabbering about something else, and I was seeing them going into the White House. And I said, wait a second, we have to take pause. Barack Hussein Obama, Michelle LaVaughn Robinson Obama, she is the descendant of slaves, which means Malia and Sasha, their children, are the descendants of slaves, and they are about to live in the White House, the most famous house on earth that was built by slaves. Let's just take pause. And I thought about a house not so far from here on the eastern shore of Maryland in St. Michael's, where Frederick Douglass was brought when he was enslaved as a youth and a teenager. It might not surprise you to know he was a troublesome slave. And he was brought to a slave breaker, a man named Ed Covey, where he was tortured and he was beaten. Ed Covey's property was Mount Misery. But Frederick Douglass fought back. He escaped and he went north and he changed the world. That property today owned by Donald Rumsfeld, Secretary of Defense Donald Rumsfeld. He bought it in 2003. He's near his friend, Vice President Dick Cheney. And I was so shocked by this when I heard this, that Mount Misery was Donald Rumsfeld's vacation home, that Denis and I raced down to St. Michael's to see if it was true. I realized I didn't know where he lived when we got there, and we were in a big rush. And so I saw an organic coffee shop ahead of us, and I thought, oh, they'll tell the truth. So I went inside, and they asked, what would I like? And I said, I'd like to know where Donald Rumsfeld lives. And they said, oh, just go down the road. He doesn't live on Mount Pleasant Road. Make a right and another right. Go to the end of the road, and that's Mount Misery Road, and that's where he lives. I thought, okay, we're on to something. So we go down the road. We don't go down Mount Pleasant. We make a right and another right. It seemed we couldn't go right enough, and we then saw the dark-tinted windows of the SUV of the Secret Service, and we knew we'd arrived. I got my video camera out, and we were zooming in as they were zooming out, and I saw, sure enough, a stake in the ground right next to the driveway that said Mount Misery. And I thought, does Donald Rumsfeld understand the significance of this place? So we raced to an ancient black church nearby. It was Sunday morning, and folks were in the sanctuary. And I asked an older woman who is the descendant of slaves, what do you make of all this historic place where Frederick Douglass was born, where he was tortured, where he escaped, and now that property is owned by Donald Rumsfeld, who himself is known for torture. And she said, I can't comment right now. We're in church. So from Mount Misery to Mount Hope, I was speaking in Rochester, New York, and afterwards a young woman said, can I take you to the Mount Hope Cemetery where Frederick Douglass is buried? We went off in the morning, about 4 in the morning before I was flying out. It was a snowstorm, and we brushed off the snowflakes of Frederick Douglass's grave. And then this young woman said, can I take you to another tombstone? And I looked quickly at my watch. Please, because I have to get on this plane. She said, please. I said, okay. We went, and she showed me the tombstone of Susan B. Anthony. Susan B. Anthony buried next to her sister. Susan B. Anthony and Frederick Douglass were not just allies, they were friends. Susan B. Anthony supported this abolition movement, and Frederick Douglass, a great feminist, seconded the women's vote resolution in 1848 at the Seneca Falls Women's Rights Convention. These are the movements that have made this country great. And then I raced off to the airport and missed my plane. I want to end with Rosa Parks, 2 minutes. Not the story you know. Not the story you know, I won't repeat it. 1955, she sits down on the bus in Montgomery, Alabama, and she launches the modern-day civil rights movement. But the fact that when she died, the networks I heard it on CNN, said she was a tired seamstress. She was no troublemaker. This is a very great point to end on. Rosa Parks was a first-class troublemaker. She knew exactly what she was doing December 1st. She was the secretary of the local NAACP. She worked with E.D. Nixon. He was the president. He came out of radical labor politics. They'd been challenging the racist laws for years. And she actually had sat down on the bus a number of times before and refused to get up. But you never know when that magic moment will come. But if you're involved in social change, you will build a foundation that helps to determine history, that determines the future. That's what Rosa Parks did. A few days later, the Montgomery Improvement Association had a meeting to choose the leader of the boycott movement. They chose a young minister who'd just come into town. He was Martin Luther King. Rosa Parks helped to launch Martin Luther King. And to show how brave she was, think of the atmosphere of the time. Go back a few months to Emmett Till, the summer of '55. Emmett Till, a 14-year-old African-American boy, his mother, Mamie Till, in Chicago, sends him to get out of the city for the summer. She sends him to family in Money, Mississippi. He's with his aunt and uncle and cousins, asleep one night when a white mob comes and rips him out of bed, and he ends up in the bottom of the Tallahatchie River. When his body was sent back to Chicago, his mother, Mamie Till, did something incredibly courageous. She said she wanted the casket open for the wake and the funeral. She wanted the world to see the ravages of racism, the brutality of bigotry. And so thousands streamed by his casket and saw, and then Jack Magazine and other black publications took photographs of his distended, mutilated head, and they were actually published, and they were seared into the history and consciousness of this country. Mamie Till had something very important to teach the press of today. Show the pictures. Show the images. Could you imagine if for just 1 week we saw the images of war everywhere? Above the fold of every surviving newspaper, a photograph and a story about a baby dead on the ground in a drone attack in Pakistan. The top of every radio and TV newscast, the story of a soldier dead or dying. On everyone's Facebook wall, every email, every tweet had to do with war, perhaps describing a woman with their legs blown off by cluster bombs. For just 1 week, Americans are a compassionate people. They would say no. War is not the answer to conflict in the 21st century. Democracy Now!